Hey everybody, welcome back to Resin Conversion Kits 101, where we are taking this Master Grade Force Impulse Gundam and we're turning it into something that's going to look even more detailed and amazing than it already does straight out of the box. And to do that, we're using all of these resin parts, right? So last time we unpacked all these from their packaging and we got them sorted out here into these trays. And today we're ready to start processing them so that they'll be ready for assembly and painting and all of those other things that we got to do later on. And so this is the main thing that we're going to look at today, are these tabs. I think I mentioned this in the previous episode, but the process of casting these resin parts requires, the resin to be poured into molds, and most of these parts will have one spot. In this case, it's this one right here, where the resin was poured into the mold. And then when they demold it, they cut it off here, but they leave this kind of large tab behind. So it's up to us to clean these up and then sand them down to make sure that they're nice and flush and they haven't left any visible scarring on the parts. So every single one of these parts in these trays should have one of these to clean up. And then while we're looking at these in detail as we're going through, we're going to also just be looking for any kinds of imperfections or anything else that needs any cleanup or sanding work or anything like that on these parts. This is a very high quality resin kit. I think I mentioned that in the last episode as well. So I don't expect there to be too many issues that need to be cleaned up with these parts, but we will take a look at them as we go through, of course, to make sure that everything is good to go. And so in order to do all of that work, we're going to need some tools. And what we're going to be using mostly today are, first of all, these nippers. So you want to have a pair of probably single-bladed nippers of this style like this, but you don't want your really expensive ones, right? So here I have my pair of God Hand nippers. I've had these for like 7 years. They've served me really well, and they're super high-quality, high-precision nippers, and they're also quite expensive. So you don't want to use those on resin parts. You want to use something a bit cheaper. These, they look similar and they're a similar style, but they're a lot less expensive. I picked them up, I think, on an Amazon Prime deal day or something like that for like $15. And so they work well, and we're going to use those. I also have a hobby knife here in case we need to do some little detailed work in areas where the nippers can't reach. So we'll be using those to trim those big gate marks off of the parts. And then once we get those trimmed down, we're going to need to do some sanding. So I've got my sanding sticks here of two varieties. I've got the hard acrylic backed ones. These are just like adhesive sandpaper that stick onto these acrylic sheets. These are great for flat edges and sharp corners. And then if you have something that's a bit smoother of a surface, you might want to use something like this where you've got a sanding sponge. So it's a little more pliable. It's good for curved surfaces and like kind of large flat surfaces. I imagine, given the amount of detail and the sharp edges on this kit, that we're going to end up using these sanding sticks, the hard ones, a lot more than we use the soft ones during the session today. But I've got them both here ready to go so that as we go through here, we can pick out what we need. The other thing that we have to talk about before we get started is safety and health. And so it is important to be aware that whenever you're dealing with dust from resin parts, so if you're trimming parts and especially if you're sanding parts, that resin dust is toxic and you don't want to be breathing that in. And so there are a couple different ways that you can try to mitigate that. One is to do wet sanding. So I do have a little bucket of water here. You can dip your sanding sticks into the water as you're going through the process, and that will help to prevent some of the dust from flying everywhere. It turns the dust into more like a paste instead of a dust, and I'll show you some of that later on. We'll do some dry sanding and some wet sanding these parts so you can see the difference. But that doesn't mitigate the dust entirely. There are also like vent fan products that you can buy. There's like these little desk, they sit here on your desk and they're meant to pull the dust away. I don't have one of those. I think they're a bit expensive for the one thing that they do, so I don't have one here in my studio. I've never felt the need to buy one. I do have a mode that I can put my spray booth into. Maybe I'll try to go over there later and get you guys some B-roll footage showing I can turn the spray booth up on its side, my custom spray booth that I built, and use it in sort of that same way to be able to pull dust away as you're sanding. I'll do some of this sanding work later over there, and I'll try to record some of that. But for now, we're staying here at the desk because I can get better video footage for you guys here. So anyway, no matter whether you've got one of those vent fan products or you're doing wet sanding, I still recommend that you use some sort of a breathing mask. And so this is the one that I have that I use for all of my painting at my spray booth. And I always put this on whenever I'm sanding resin parts as well. Whether I'm doing it there in front of the fan or here at the desk, yeah, you just want to be careful and safe. And so it's never, it never hurts to be as safe as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this on, and then we'll get started with the sanding work. And obviously I can't talk, do a live voiceover over the footage as we go, because you guys won't be able to hear anything I'm saying. So any voiceover that you hear from now on is going to be me recorded later as I'm editing this in post, so that I can still be safe and sand this stuff, and you can still hear what's going on and the techniques that I use. So I'm going to put this thing on and let's get started. All right, so we're starting here with that same part that we looked at earlier. We've got this one big tab to remove. So you might be tempted just to try to take your nippers and go flush all the way down against the part in one trim and just take the whole thing off. I would caution against that, because resin does tend to be pretty brittle and you can't put back material if you take off too much. So what I always try to do is just take a few little snips. Here I'm just kind of taking triangles off of that tab, and I'm working my way down until what's left is almost flush with the part. And then we'll do the rest of it with sanding. All right, so that's looking pretty good. We've got most of that off now, and we've grabbed our 400 grit sanding stick, and I'm just gonna gently start to sand that down. Now you'll see here this does take a little bit of time, and a lot of sanding, or a lot of dust, is going to come off of this part as we start sanding it. So you'll start to see that accumulate both on the part and on my fingers and on the mat down below. I'm always with my thumb trying to just brush off the dust that's there so that I can get a good look at how much of the little nub is left. I'm just trying to get that thing as perfectly smooth with that surface as I can, again, without taking off too much material. You can see now the amount of dust that's built up on my fingers and on the mat down below. So that was dry sanding, and we'll take a look at what that looks like with wet sanding in just a minute. I do have this brush. It's just a makeup brush that I picked up at a local store that I use to try to clean the dust off so that I can make sure that everything looks good. So there's that part completed compared to its match, the opposite side front skirt for the kit. And so now we're going to do that second part, the same one again, but this time we're going to do some wet sanding so that you can see the difference. Again, I'm just trimming the tab down flush or almost flush as a starting point. And now we'll bring in our little bucket of water. I'm going to go ahead and dust that sandpaper off, so you can see all of that dust was just accumulated from that one part that we did before. Now I'm going to dip that in the water, and we'll do the same thing again, but this time with the sandpaper having a bit of water on it. There is definitely a lot less dust coming off the part, and it's instead accumulating kind of on the surface and the edges of the part. So you can see there's a lot of white kind of paste forming there. I'm about to rub it off with my finger, I think. So that white paste is all of that dust kind of congealed together with the water. And what I find in my experience is that the paste is a bit more annoying to me than the dust, because I can't just brush it away with that makeup brush. And I'm always kind of looking to remove it to see if I've sanded enough to see if my surface is flush and ready to go. And it just kind of gets in the way for me. So I still prefer to do the dry sanding and just deal with the dust everywhere and make sure I clean it up really well afterwards. You can see here I'm rubbing on that surface with my thumb and the palm of my hand, trying to get the water and the paste that's left behind off of the surface so I can see whether I'm done or not. And I think at this point I decided that we're good to go. Yeah, so that looks good. So that's our final part. So there's the difference between wet and dry sanding. And again, for me, I prefer dry sanding. Now I've gone on to some really small parts here. These are two parts that were connected together when we pulled them out of the packaging. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take two big snips to cut this big piece that was connecting them together off, and that gets set to the side because it's not needed anymore. And you'll see I left a fairly big amount of that tab left behind there, and so I'm going to do that same technique of cutting off little bits, working my way down to almost flush with the part. And then the only difference here is when we go to sand this, just to be a lot more careful, right? Because we don't want to take off too much material here. These small thin parts can be a lot more delicate and you can accidentally sand off more than you want. So I'm going to just very carefully kind of go in small individual strokes with the sandpaper back and forth until I get that thing perfectly flush and the little extra bit of resin that was left over is gone. All right, here's another vent part, and this one I did go ahead and use the sanding sponge instead because this has a rounded edge to it. So instead of that flat piece, which I would have to kind of do some movement with my wrist to get the right amount of curve, this sponge works better for that kind of a situation. And I can get a nice curved edge, again going very carefully because it's a small part. Then inspecting it, and I think I see here that there's kind of one little point left on that curved edge, and so I go back one more time to just smooth that out. And that looks good to me at that point. Now this piece is a bit different. It's actually got this one large tab, but it's connected in 3 spots. So if you look very closely, you can see there's gaps right there. So it's connected to the outer edges of this thing and then also the center. So I'm going to start by taking the big portions of the tab off again, just by cutting little triangles like we've done. But then I need to be very careful as we disconnect it from the piece because those 2 outer sides where it connects are actually a bit higher. They stick out a bit over that center part. And so I don't want to just cut this and then sand it down flat because I'll lose that little extra detail of those 2 little side bits that stick out. And so what I'm done here is I'm cutting as close as I can with the nippers, and then we're going to have to switch to the hobby knife to shave off that inner section there that's in between those 2 parts that stick up. Again, always going very carefully and slowly at first because you can never put back material that when you take off too much. There are certainly ways with putty and other things to patch any mistakes, but it's better to just never make the mistakes in the first place. So there I'm pretty happy with that trim job. And then what I do with my sanding stick is these outer little points, I'm being careful with them like I would with a very small piece. Just a few little hits with the sandpaper to smooth those out, but not taking too much material off. And then that area in between, when I put the adhesive on these sanding sticks, I always have one end where I roll it over the end of the stick. And so that way I can use that flat, thin edge of the stick to do detailed sanding in little small areas like this. So you'll see I'm being very careful and using the edge of my sanding stick here to smooth out that area in between those 2 protrusions so that I don't sand them down by accident. And this is going to take a little bit longer with this part. It's fine, delicate work, but I prefer to go slow and take my time, and again, not take off too much material. Being careful now will save you headaches later with trying to patch things up. If you went quick and took too much material off, you're going to regret it down the road for sure. So I'd rather take my time here. I went back with the knife, did a little bit more cleanup there, and then we're going to do one final pass with the end of the sanding stick and get this thing looking just right. And so after repeating that trimming and sanding process a whole lot of times, we've got all the parts ready to go. I've got them back sorted in their trays again, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Now, that whole process for me took somewhere between 5 and 6 hours total of trimming and sanding time. I did not do it all in one session. I find that my focus starts to drift after a while, and so I'd rather take a break and come back and start again just to make sure that I'm focused and making sure that I don't make any little mistakes as we go along. So when I'm not recording footage for you guys for these videos, I'm usually like listening to a podcast or music or something in the background while I'm working on this. And I find it to not be too tedious and boring. I find it to actually be kind of relaxing work. But again, I don't want to sit here for hours and hours, so I do take breaks. And for me, this was 3 different sessions over 2 days of getting these parts ready to go. But now that they are ready to go, in the next episode of this series, we'll go ahead and start to put these things together. So we need to test fit them onto our plastic inner frame that came with our Gundam kit, make sure that everything's fitting and that there aren't any additional adjustments we need to make to these parts. So that'll be next time, and I will see you then. And until then, I hope you have a good day.